Hello everyone, Derek Johnson with Tatango.com. Wanted to do a quick video about what is going on with Remind.com and Verizon. So if you haven't been watching, there's a lot of back and forth between Verizon and Remind.com. Remind.com is a kind of like a website that helps school educators, teachers, administrations, districts send text messages to students and parents. And Verizon has announced that they're now going to be taxing those messages. Now, not just those specific messages, but to get into all the complexity, we have to really go back to figure out what is going on here. And each Verizon and Remind are kind of putting their own spin on this. And interesting is that all the press that's being generated is really looking at kind of what is happening between Remind and Verizon, but this is a much bigger issue, and it affects really everybody in the United States. So let's go back, way back to 2018, and I'm looking at my notes here if you see my eyes kind of glancing off. So November 12th, 2018, Tatango got word that Verizon was going to be implementing what we call in our industry, text message marketing, a carrier pass-through fee. I'm putting quotes because it is kind of called a bunch of different things. Essentially, they don't like calling it a tax, but it's a fee that Verizon charges that because we call it a carrier pass-through fee, that means usually it goes from the carrier to an aggregator, then to the software provider, and then gets passed on to the brand. Usually a brand would be like Chipotle, Macy's, Gap, the brand that is sending the text messages to the consumer. Now, on this side, it's very interesting because Remind, the end user, is not a brand, it's not a corporation, an enterprise. It's like a school or a kindergarten teacher. So you can see kind of where this is going. That kind of feels a little weird that Verizon is saying, hey, you want to reach, Verizon customers. And again, they are Verizon customers because they're on the Verizon network. If you want to reach Verizon customers, you have to pay a little bit of money to reach them. So we announced that that was being rolled out. Now this is being rolled out on 10-digit phone numbers. So this has always been, or at least for the last 5 or 10 years, depending on the carrier, but this has always been a fee that has been implemented and charged to short code users. Short codes are those 5 to 6-digit phone numbers. So in the short code industry, we're very used to this carrier pass-through fee. We get it from the wireless carriers, and then we pass it off to our customers. And that is not the fee that we charge them. That's the fee essentially that the carrier charges. So at Tatango, we charge a messaging fee to use Tatango for Tatango to send the message. And then essentially there's a termination fee that is added on top of that. And that termination fee or carrier pass-through fee varies based on the wireless carrier and whether it's SMS or MMS. So it's very complex, obviously. So when a brand like Chipotle, Macy's, they want to send out a text message, they're going to pay Tatango's messaging fee, which is our fee to pass it off to the carrier, and then the carrier is going to charge their own fee, kind of like a tax almost, because it's added on top of the fee that Tatango charges, to the brand. So we announced that on November 12th, we announced on November 12th, 2018, that this fee was going to be implemented on long codes in our industry. Those are the 10-digit phone numbers. So Verizon actually will be the first wireless carrier in the United States to implement these carrier pass-through fees on a long code, a 10-digit phone number, a regular phone number. Tatango, we deal in 5 to 6-digit phone numbers, which are called short codes. We're used to these fees. They've been around forever. Now the carriers are starting to say, hey, we see all this traffic coming from 10-digit phone numbers. We want to also tax those messages as well, because honestly, at the end of the day, Verizon, they're having to deal with, spam. They're having to deal with throughput issues. They're having, to support these networks and the messages. So they're saying, to do all that, we need a little bit, to come to Verizon. So when we announced it, and I think it's the same that currently that Verizon uh, is charging. It's 2.5 tenths of a cent per message. So that's the carrier pass-through fee that Verizon said they were going to implement, and this is back in November 12th, 2018. So a few months ago. So they said, hey, if you're going to be using a 10-digit phone number, like Remind their users do, on our network, and you want to send a message and terminate it to a Verizon phone number, you have to pay Verizon 2.5 tenths of a cent. So not 1 cent, a lot less. So what is that? 1/4 of a cent almost. So 2.5 tenths of a cent. Now, the problem is, and you can see kind of the issue here, is Verizon saying, hey, this is a carrier pass-through fee, just pass it off to the end user. Remind.com is going, well, our end users are parents, schools, and Remind from their statements are saying we don't even charge those customers to use our platform, so now we got to charge them this Verizon fee. That's where the issue is coming up, because now Remind is saying, essentially, if we want to continue to use Verizon and allow our customers, which are educators, to send messages, we have to eat the cost. So they're saying the cost is going to go from $360,000 a year up to $4 million. Now, why are they currently paying $360,000? Well, that's because there's, in between Remind and the wireless carrier, there's usually an aggregator. Now, in this case, Remind's aggregator is a company called Twilio.com. So Remind actually pays, and this is all kind of coming out in the press releases and the blogs, which is interesting too, because usually this information is relatively private and held really close to the vest. So both sides are kind of releasing a lot of interesting info for the people that are in the industry like I am. So it looks like, because Verizon says that Remind.com sends 1.6 billion with a B text messages a year on the Verizon network, that means Remind.com is paying Twilio currently $360,000 to send the message off to Verizon, and right now Verizon maybe gets a little percentage of that. It depends on what the deal is, but there's no extra fee on top of that. That's the fee that then is coming in February, which then is called the carrier pass-through fee, will be passed off to Twilio. And then Twilio is essentially supposed to pass it off to Remind, and then Remind is supposed to pass it off to the end user, like a Chipotle, Macy's, Gap. But they're going, that's the disconnect right there. They don't want to pass it off to, a middle school. So if you calculate, which is super interesting, if you calculate 1.6 billion text messages and a $360,000 spend to Twilio, that means Remind is paying Twilio to send messages to Verizon 2.25 1/100th of a cent. So we're talking very, very little amounts, but when you're talking 1.6 billion text messages, it adds up. So currently, Remind.com, their bill to Twilio to send messages to Verizon is $360,000. Now, when Verizon adds on their tax or their carrier pass-through fee starting in February, that will add 2.5 tenths of a cent to each individual message, and that's 1.6 billion text messages to Verizon. That is how all these press releases and Remind.com is saying that their bill is going to go from $360,000 to $4 million. Now, be very clear here, Twilio doesn't make any extra money here. They make more revenue, but the profit is exactly the same because it's a pass-through fee. The essentially $3+ million that are carrier fees go from the carrier to Twilio, and then Twilio just says, hey, Remind.com, you have to pay this. So they're not making any profit on the carrier fee that is being passed between the two. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of background. This is also happening to, at least this is what Verizon is telling everybody, they're charging this pass-through fee to everybody that is using a 10-digit long code. So this includes everybody. This is Remind.com. This is if Uber is using, a 10-digit phone number to message you, they're being charged that. Everybody in the United States is being charged starting in February, a little pass-through fee to hit Verizon customers with a message on a 10-digit phone number. So now this has nothing to do with consumers. So if you have your phone on you and you're texting a Verizon customer, this has nothing to do with that. This is more for A to P messages, application to person. So think apps and websites, two-factor authentication, things like that. That's where this fee is being added on. So again, we announced that this fee would be coming, and we announced this on November 12th, 2018. It would start on February 1st, 2019. So on January 12th, 2019, Remind.com, they put up a blog post, and they essentially spelled out, the fee, saying, guys, we cannot support your messages to Verizon anymore because it's going to cost a ton of money. It's going to go from $360,000 a year up to $4 million a year. And so they started spinning kind of it to be favorable for Remind.com, saying, customers, this seems unfair because you're, a public school, you're a teacher, your parents. You can see it kind of doesn't sound that good for Verizon at this point. So they started saying, we have 7 million parents and students that are on Verizon. Starting February 1st, we're not going to pay those fees, Remind.com, so we're not going to send you those messages. We're going to stop supporting Verizon users. And they essentially said, the alternative step is download the app, the mobile app, because we can send over-the-top messages via the app and we won't support Verizon. But then they started saying, okay, if you're pissed off about this as a parent, as an educator, we need to let Verizon know. And that's usually the best way, is when consumers start talking to the carriers, then the consumers start making kind of, their demands known. That's what they did. So they started a couple hashtags, reverse the fee, that was a hashtag, and then hashtag not spam. Now this is an interesting one because they say in their blog post, Verizon would begin, this is Remind.com, Verizon would begin charging Remind an additional fee intended to reduce spam on its network. Kind of correct. They're definitely spinning it, because they're essentially calling Verizon out and saying, hey, Verizon, you're doing this because, of spam, but our messages aren't spam, obviously, so why are you taxing us? It is a little correct, but they're definitely putting a spin on it. Verizon is charging this fee not only because they want to make a little bit of money because you're using their wireless network, but they have a big system in place for vetting phone numbers, for filtering spam, and it's being applied to everybody in the industry. So it's not like Verizon is saying, Remind.com, you are spamming people, therefore we're going to tax you. They're essentially saying, hey, entire industry, we're going to tax you so that we can monitor the entire industry, we can filter messages, we can protect Verizon customers. Because at the end of the day, Verizon customers are the most important people to Verizon. So you can see the spin here, and you can see why there was a hashtag not spam. So that's kind of Remind.com's take. Now there has been a lot of press in it. Some of the press makes it seem like this is just for Remind.com. Again, this is for everybody in the industry that is using a 10-digit phone number. Okay, so now we've covered kind of what happened. January 12th, that was when the blog post went out by Remind.com. What was interesting, and you very rarely see this, and this is why consumers have a lot of power, is Verizon actually responded to Remind.com in a press release, and this came out on January 17th, so about 5 days later. They essentially said in the press release, as discussed this week with Remind.com, Verizon will not charge Remind fees as long as they don't begin charging K-12 schools, educators, parents, and students using its free text message service. So a few things here. Verizon essentially kind of backed off on, hey, we're going to charge everybody in the industry a carrier pass-through fee that is using a 10-digit phone number. They're essentially saying, and I don't know, how this actually extends to other companies or other use cases, but they're saying, look, K through 12 schools, as long as you're not charging for the service. So to Tango, we charge for our service because we deal with big enterprise customers and want to reach their customers. Remind.com, they do and they don't charge for their service. I think that's kind of what they're hinting at here. They're saying, hey, if you don't charge for your service, so you don't charge, a school teacher for the service of Remind.com, we're not going to send that carrier pass-through fee, and increase your fees to reach those students and parents. So that was the statement by Verizon. Very interesting because wireless carriers never respond usually to things, especially kind of minute details like carrier pass-through fees and short codes. So this is very interesting. It must have their hashtag campaign from Remind.com, the hashtag reverse the fee, hashtag not spam. You can see it on Twitter. I guarantee Verizon got a lot of phone calls, angry parents, and Verizon essentially had to release a press release and kind of give their side of the story. Also, they gave Remind.com a little a present, essentially saying, hey, we won't do these carrier pass-through fees for K through 12 schools. Now, it wasn't made apparent to me or obvious in the press release. Will this apply to all K through 12 schools as long as they're not charging for the service? So there's other services very similar to Remind.com. What about them? Will they get this same deal? And then if they don't, isn't that unfair to these other people? So we'll see what happens there. As you can start seeing, this can unravel very quickly. What about universities? They're not K through 12. What about nonprofits? What about political? I think you're going to see a lot of groups and organizations look at what Remind.com did and said, hey, Remind.com, got a pass on the carrier pass-through fees. We want the same thing for political messages. We want the same thing for nonprofit messages. I doubt it'll happen for if you're, the local dog groomer or restaurant or bar. I don't know how they could get, Verizon to waive the fees for those because they're more marketing type messages. But I think Remind.com has set the standard and they've shown how it works. It's essentially get your customers that are on the wireless network to complain to the carrier, and that's what Remind.com has done here to Verizon. So then after Verizon released this press release, the Remind.com posted another blog post, and they essentially said, we're not happy yet. It's not time to stop fighting. They said there's a couple different things. They said there's no signed agreement. So they're like, look, Verizon has said this in a press release, but again, it's kind of vague. We want a signed agreement that we're not going to be charged these carrier pass-through fees. Number two is it doesn't cover, so this is Remind.com saying this, it doesn't cover preschools, daycares, colleges, churches, youth organizations. You can start seeing where this is going. They're essentially saying, look, that's nice, Verizon, you gave us K through 12 schools, but what about all these other things like nonprofits, churches? I guarantee political groups are going to start kind of making a stink about this fee and saying, hey, this is not fair. So that's at this point, and this is Friday, at this point, that's kind of where we're at. Originally, it was a fee that was going to be applied uniformly across the entire industry for 10-digit phone numbers on Verizon. We announced that. I think we broke that story that it was happening. Then January 12th, 2019, Remind came out and said, hey, users, this is completely ridiculous. We're going to have to shut off the service. You need to complain to Verizon. 5 days later, Verizon came out and said, don't worry about, Remind.com is going to get a pass on K through 12 messaging, and as long as they keep the service free. Now, it's very interesting to note that Remind.com has raised, according to Crunchbase, $60 million. That's with an M, $60 million. They have ways of making money. Who actually is paying for the end service is the district. So I think there's just a lot of unknowns here. So that was where Verizon came out and said, hey, K through 12, don't worry about Remind.com, you're good. Now, they didn't say that to anybody else, at least from what I'm hearing. And then just recently, Remind.com came out with a blog post in response to Verizon's press release and said, that's great, Verizon.com, but we need that in writing. And most likely, we want that to cover everything. Preschool, daycares, colleges, churches, youth organizations. I don't know where that list ends. Now, what's interesting is Verizon was, the first, or is the first wireless carrier to announce these carrier pass-through fees. They will not be the last carrier to announce these pass-through fees. So Verizon is the first one. They're going to take all the arrows. They're going to learn from what's happening here. But this is also going to happen for AT&T, Sprint, T-Mobile. I'm guessing. Again, there's no specific or defined timeline or what the fees will be. But this is just kind of how our industry works. Is once one wireless carrier rolls out fees, most of them will also roll out wireless carrier fees. So on short codes, those are those 5 to 6 digit phone numbers. Every wireless carrier has a pass-through fee. On 10 digit, none of them do until Verizon said they're going to, and that'll be February 1st. I guarantee AT&T, T-Mobile, they're going to be looking at Verizon going, okay, if Verizon is making money off this, we want to make money off this. And that also pays for, again, the service, preventing spam, monitoring. It's a huge amount of work from the wireless carrier's perspective to manage all of these 10-digit phone numbers, deal with their customer complaints. So that's why they're charging these fees. So that's where we're at right now. It'll be very interesting to see Verizon's official response in terms of what is covered, what's not. Will they continue to add kind of caveats to their carrier pass-through fee? It seems like already they're saying K through 12 as long as you're not charging for the service, but that would kind of remove a lot of services, because how would a service make money if they're not charging for it? Who knows? Anyway, I just wanted to get on video, kind of give a background from somebody that's been in SMS for the last 10, 11 years, because I think there's a lot of backstory and context that's missing from some of the announcements and press coverage that I'm seeing out there. If anyone has any questions, or if I said something wrong in the video, again, I'm just going off what I'm seeing from the press releases and the blog posts. Let me know. My email is Derek, DEREK, @tetango.com. And we'll link to some of the blog posts and some of the press releases in the video notes below.